The Lost American, Chapter 1: The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first. Towards the end of Chapter 1 in Unrestricted Warfare, there is a quote that really caught my eye. The quote was as follows: "We believe that some morning people will wake up to discover with surprise that quite a few gentle and kind things have begun to make offensive and lethal characteristics." As I read this quote in the chapter, I made a note in the column. Makes me think of 9/11. To me, that quote in a lot of ways sums up what this chapter is about. Future warfare does not have to be about high technology. Instead, it can come in many forms. The two colonels, I believe, make that very clear in this chapter. The colonels start by arguing that high technology cannot be a synonym for future warfare. The reason for this is that high and low technology are relative concepts. Weapon systems that at one moment in time appear advanced will be old weapons in another moment. The authors give the example of the M60 tank, the Cobra attack helicopter, and the B-52 bomber being high technology in the 1960s and 70s. Today, those weapon systems would seem partly outdated compared to newer stuff such as the F-35. They use this example to constantly show that new technology is arriving. They further go on to say that the F-22 is still a fighter and the Tomahawk cruise missile is still a missile. To me, I took this all in to mean that future warfare does not mean that we'll be fighting with laser guns and lightsabers one day. Technology is not what one should be thinking about with how the future warfare could look. Don't get caught up in the idea that future weapons will only look more futuristic. The authors then move into talking about the differences between two phrases: fighting a fight that fits one's weapons and making the weapons to fit the fight. Fighting a fight to fit one's weapons basically means that you have weapons and formulate tactics to fight with those weapons. I think what they mean here is that you have weapons like spears and you can use them in a Greek phalanx. You have horses that can be used to attack your opponent's flanks. The fight that you are fighting will match the weapons that you have. Making the weapons to fit the fight is much different. In this case, you do the reverse. Develop tactics and then create weapons that allow you to execute your tactics. An example of this is the U.S. military's doctrine of air-land battle. In this doctrine, the land units act as an aggressive maneuvering defense while the air units attack rear echelon military units. At this point, I will also say that the authors state that when the U.S. military decided to switch to the concept of making the weapons to fit the fight, that it was the greatest single change in the relationship between weapons and tactics since the advent of war. However, the biggest disadvantage to making the weapons to fit the fight is that you really don't know what the future of warfare will bring. The authors state that it's like preparing food for a banquet without knowing who is coming. The U.S. military, by all appearances, would seem to be able to easily take on an enemy in Somalia in 1993, but instead it became a struggle. The same thing happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The U.S. military had fancy tactics as well as weapons, but had great difficulty winning against its opponent. The authors even point out that perhaps there is a rule here, or at least it is an interesting phenomenon. They also state that the closer the generation gap is, the more pronounced are the battle successes of the more senior generation, while the more the gap opens, the less each party is capable of dealing with the other. I think a lot of people know that weapons of warfare are expensive. Looking at the cost of an F-35 jet fighter on Google, it's about $78 million. I'll say I hope that's right. This is just an example of one element of war. The authors specifically state to ensure that the weapons are in the lead, one must continue to take up the ante in development cost. The result of this continued rising of the stakes is that no one has enough money to maintain the lead. The way out of this ever higher cost of weapons of war is to take a different approach. This is where I think things really start to get interesting. If weapons of war are becoming so much more expensive, then what's the solution? One possible idea is to start to think differently about warfare, change out how it can be fought. It cannot be denied that man-made earthquakes, tsunamis, weather disasters, or subsonic waves and new biological and chemical weapons all constitute new concept weapons. Here we start to really see what the authors are going to get at. War is not just about fighting someone directly with swords and a shield. There are a multitude of ways that one can fight their opponent. I have to say that a lot of this somewhat reminds me of when I read B.H. Lytle Hart's book Strategy, An Indirect Approach. One has to start looking at warfare not as just about weapons and basic tactics. Instead, anything can be used for warfare. They further drive home the point with the following quote: as we see it, a single man made stock market crash, a single computer virus invasion, or a single rumor or scandal that results in a fluctuation in the enemy country's exchange rates or exposes the leaders of an enemy country on the internet, all these things are included in the ranks of new concept weapons. Now I find this chapter's last section goes off in a different direction. The authors talk about the lethality of weapons and how that has changed since the dawn of nuclear weapons, as well as in the last part of the 20th century. Since the dawn of warfare, humans have looked for weapons that made war more lethal in order to have an advantage over their enemy. Nuclear weapons were the ultimate lethal weapon. The problem then became a new one. How do we defeat our enemy without risking the destruction of the planet? One way around this is to strike at the enemy's command and control elements. With modern weapons, this may be easy to do. Thus, the best way to achieve victory in the modern era may not be to kill, but instead to control your opponent. Weapons in many cases are not being used to kill thousands of people with no point. Instead, precision strikes are becoming more and more common. Compare a bombing campaign in the Iraq War to a bombing campaign in World War II. One used targeted bombing, whereas the other used massive firebombing. Growing up, I remember learning that in Vietnam, North Vietnamese preferred to injure a U.S. soldier than kill him. The reason why is that it would take more soldiers to treat a wounded soldier than a dead one. Over time, these casualties can strip away their opponent's will to fight. One could argue that nations are developing kinder weapons, weapons that aren't so much designed to kill and crush one's opponent, but still bend their will to make them collapse. The authors in this chapter are speaking of the effect of these kinder weapons. It may alter the cruel purpose of war, but there is no way to change the essence of war, which is one of compulsion, and therefore cannot alter its cruel outcome either. With that, this chapter is over. Next, we move into chapter 2.